Ladies and gentlemen, because our speakers are disciplined and because we have lacked the presence of Mr. Buzek, there is 10 minutes for comments from the floor, and there will not be question and answers in the next panel. So if you have questions, now you have 10 minutes to ask them. The floor is open. Not enough coffee. I have a question which I would ask Vice President Timmermans, because you've made your own remarks and then listened both to what your fellow Commissioner and Mr. Lamassoure said. We think we have a purpose, we fear a vision, we think we have values, but we need to update them. What is the process, what is the method, to pick up Mr. Lamassoure's closing comments, that you think is legitimate, and particularly a legitimate method here at the European level, which can add value upwards and downwards, whichever way you think that may work?
Thank you for that easy question. I think what is most important, having listened also to the other contributions, is that we create helixes where we interface what people are doing at different levels on different issues. We've seen in the technology business that jealously keeping what you know looks nice for a while, but it doesn't help anyone. And open sourcing has become the thing what makes companies grow and what makes science evolve even faster. And I think that in what I would call a post-paternalistic society, such as ours, not just development of science or the confrontation of different cultures or opinions, but also the creation of regulation needs to be something that is open-sourced more than we did in the past. Just imagine that in how we make laws, European Parliament, Council and Commission, even the simplest of laws take up to 2 to 3 years to be adopted. And then you relate that to what's happening in the technological world, and it's simply completely out of sync. So we need to rethink the way we legislate, not just legislate, but also how we regulate at a lower level and how people relate to regulation. Policing is not going to help, but being part of it is probably what is going to help. And the final point, which I didn't make in my intervention, which I think is extremely important, we need to have a better understanding between generations, because I truly believe that my kids' brains are wired differently, literally wired differently, because of the technological revolution. And when I see my kids' generation, they are very idealistic, but they're also very individualistic. They sometimes lack the capacity to organize. And there I think there's across generations, there's something we can learn from each other, to create networks and organization, and to understand that it takes a village to take a decision on these issues.
Thank you. I think the openness point is important, but also, again, we touch a paradox, because you say on the one hand, more open processes, on the other, maybe that is actually contrary to the run of play at the moment. Maybe we are closing down, although it's never been easier to do open processes. And to Mr. Lamassoure's comment about how the weather is better than economics, if you connect an economy well enough, and Estonia is a good example, there are people working between Oxford and Tallinn at the moment who can tell you what the weather is today in that market because of the internet of the economy, because of real-time knowledge of payments, purchases, transactions. And so maybe those sorts of connections can help to be part of the regulator's answer. Mr. Lamassoure.
You are perfectly right, and I'm going to Tallinn, Estonia, in 2 days. In 2 days. One more comment. Of course, we have a problem of interpretation of values. We have common values among Europeans. Those values referred to in Article 2 of our treaty and in the 61st articles of the admirable Charter of Fundamental Rights of the human being. But even among Europeans, we give to these common values different interpretations. The right for life, for instance, is interpreted differently in some member states. For instance, abortion is still banned in some member states and permitted elsewhere. But our values are still common values, and when we compare with the rest of the world, I take just one example, bioscience. For instance, nobody, no European scientist, and hopefully no so-called Western scientists, would dare set up, invent a chimera. But we fear that elsewhere, in Asia, South Korea, or I don't know, values are different, legislation is different, and possibly some chimera will be brought to life someday. What can we do in Europe and at global level? It's a big question mark. Needless to say, I have not the answer.
Yes, and we'll benefit in the next panel from voices from many continents. And one of the interesting questions is whether the good old-fashioned multilateral Westphalian methods of answering questions like that have any validity today, when some of our leading nations are unsure of that, and popular opinion is equally not wildly supportive of things like the World Trade Organization. So, interesting question. Ladies and gentlemen, I now see a forest of hands. The lady in number 69, she can't see the number. Yeah. There we go.
My name is Sophie Intveld, member of the European Parliament in the Liberal group, and I have a remark to Mr. Lamassoure, but if you'll allow me one devious observation before I make that remark. I think when we talk about next generation, then maybe all male panels are really not very 21st century anymore. Which is, of course, not your fault, but I think this is just not of today anymore. No, but I was triggered by what Mr. Lamassoure says about values, because I think that's actually it's a key issue, because as Mr. Timmermans rightfully underlines, we are struggling with the differences in speed between the legislative process, which does require time in order to be careful and high quality, and the speed of technological change. And I think the only answer to that is that we do need to define our shared values, because that will be the basis for legislation and regulation, whatever the procedure will be like. And I think that is why it's so important that we get beyond the stage where we say, oh no, values is not a matter for the European Union, it is strictly national. It is not, it never has been. But it certainly shouldn't be. If we want to make European legislation, it can only work if we do so on the basis of shared values. Does that mean that every single individual EU citizen is going to share the same values? Of course not. But neither do they at national level. But we need to stop being coy about this. It shouldn't be a taboo anymore. And yes, we do have to adopt shared values, which are the basis then of our common policies, whatever the legislative process is going to be like, because that is the only common response we can have to whatever technological progress is going to be.
So then if I offer myself a devious comment as well, the interesting question then is, what is the status of these values that we develop quickly? Can we approach an agile principle of lawmaking and discovery of values such that when we've said something, it's open to further iteration? It's a rough consensus, rather than saying we make something and then it sits there for 50 years and it takes another 20 years to change. I think that the status of the statement is what gets in the way of agility. So I think we have a sort of existential problem for people in institutional world. Yeah, please. Well,
I don't think, I'm not sure I fully understand, but of course, the whole debate on values has never been static. It's always ongoing, always. And it's not, I mean, there have always been periods in history where we somehow had to respond to very rapid either technological changes or changes of a different nature. But the basis always have to be those common principles, common values, and they have to be common to the community of European citizens. That's what I'm trying to say, because otherwise you cannot cope with the challenges in whatever legislative process you have.
I think that the problem is if you believe that the guarantors of morality are the ones sitting in parliaments and in governments creating legislation, I think you'll never get it right because technology moves too fast. So I think we have a strong interest in incorporating in the creators of technology the moral checks and balances we as a society want to have. So we should rethink the role of legislation. Legislation isn't the only way to deal with this. I think there is, corporate social responsibility, but corporate moral responsibility is going to be more and more important in the years to come because of the speed with which society develops. So we should also make sure that we have a society that can create that at that level rather than just leave it with parliaments, judges and politicians.
Yeah, but indeed, because legislation reflects morality and the common values that have been set in a public debate and not the other way round.
That's what we hope. And then what happens, so the interesting thing is on the corporate role, will companies accept feedback loops as the price for the validation of their role? And for the institutional legislators, the question is whether one would agree to delegate more, to leave more space for secondary and spontaneous principle-compliant interventions. These are very hard things to say yes to, especially when we're doing institutional jobs. But the companies, there are companies in the room, companies are not comfortable either about being accountable for their self-regulation. It's a difficult discussion. Of course, now everybody wants to continue, and then the chairman will start the next session late. So I think finishing on time is the key. Maybe yes, okay. I give one colleague the floor at Michelangelo's suggestion, Professor Floridi, who happens to hail from Oxford inter alia, but an interesting choice on the part of my neighbour because actually you do a lot of this stuff around ethics, which Mr. Timmermans talked about.
Thank you. I'm honoured to be able to have a word on this, and I would like to thank you for your intervention. It's more like a clarification, and I wonder whether you'll be happy with this clarification. This myth about speed of technology and therefore we cannot catch up, when it comes to ethics, it's about direction. And if we know where we are going, you can't get there fast enough. So can we just talk about where we're going, not how fast we're going there? Because if we like the direction, well, I just wait for the technology to be even faster than it is now. The problem is that we don't have a direction, and therefore we're worried about how fast we're going into the darkness. So how do we cope with this direction, one thing, speed is another?
Carlos, the mot de la fin.
No, I think it's an extremely, really interesting comment you made, because I think that the problem is that today you are regulating the micro, you're regulating products, you're regulating things that 5 years down the road do not exist anymore. So I think that your comment is really wise in the sense that we should be regulating the direction where we go. And if you regulate the direction, then you're not afraid of how fast you go. The thing is that we are in a totally different world where the day-to-day of the legislator goes to a nitty-gritty of legislation, of the product, of the thing, of the innovation. And that's why, as the Commissioner for Innovation, I get very scared of it, because I see that a lot of the great things I see, they will not see the light, because there will be some regulation at some point that will just catching and not letting go. And so I think that I just wanted to comment and thank you for the comment, because I think that's something that we should repeat for the governments, for the legislator, for the members of parliament. And the experience that we're doing that was created in the Netherlands called the innovation deals, it's exactly that. It's about putting people around the table and discussing not just the legislator, but putting the companies, putting the regulators, and saying, what's the impairment here? Is because we went too much down to the micro or not? If not, we're not regulating the direction. So thank you for your comment. Very inspiring.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've set the bar fairly high both for the next panel and for your discussions in different sessions over the next couple of days. The challenge I take away is the tension between speed and direction. So if you can't have a direction if the speed is zero. So there is somewhere a tension about getting the direction right, but also having a common sense that we are making headway, as one would say. And secondly, the challenge to all of us to conceive something completely different in terms of the societal framing of an internet that will be completely different. And there I liked the sort of key words I heard around feedback loops, helical processes, open processes, and I think that's something we can take into the next session. A hand of applause for our opening panelists. Please stay in